So the structured query language. The structured query language, which is shortly called as a SQL, which is the most important skill that every person in the engineering world, the software engineering world, has to know, because it's one of the important skills that you should need to have in your resume. Okay, so all right, the SQL, the structured query language. So before starting with the SQL thing, let's understand how does a spreadsheet basically work. So because spreadsheet is something, one of the oldest applications which evolved before the databases came into existence, correct? So that means this is one of the important skills in 1970s. So when you look at the Excel sheet, so how does an Excel sheet basically looks like is, this is how it looks like, right? So when you open an Excel sheet, you will be seeing something called as the tab sheets. So what is a tab sheet basically? So let me open an Excel sheet and then show you how does it looks like. So then okay, this is how the Excel sheet looks like, right? So every Excel sheet has been given with a name. As I opened it freshly, I could see the name as book 1. But if you go little down, you could also see the tab sheets. These are called as the tab sheets. So let's say if I wanted to store the student's information into this Excel sheet, I'll be creating a tab sheet called employee details as one tab sheet, and I'll also be creating the department of that employee belongs to in the other tab sheet, and I will also be creating some other information about that employee, let's say the demographics of an employee in another tab sheet. Okay, so I had opened a tab sheet which will hold the employee information, which basically has three tab sheets. So one of it is the employee details, which will have a high level employee information, and the department will have the department information of an employee, and the demographics, that means employee belongs to which state, which country, which region, all that information will be stored over here. Okay, so now if I go to the employee details, or for say any sort of a tab sheet, what will I see here? I will see columns and rows. So A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T are basically called to be the columns of my tab sheet, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, so on are called as the rows. So any tab sheet, for say you take in the Excel sheet, will have rows and columns. Okay, so now I'm going to add few columns to my tab sheet, and the first row basically holds the column names. So the name of the columns are like this. One of it is the employee ID, and the second one is going to be the employee name, and I don't need to add an employee because this anyways has the employee information. So the name, the ID, and then I can also have I can say this as a first name maybe, and I can also add a last name as a column. In the same way, I can also add several such information, but I'll restrict to these three columns per se. So if you look at this particular employee details tab sheet, this has three columns. So one of it is an ID, and other is the first name, and other is the last name. Now I will fill in this with some information, say 1, and I will give name as Prithvi Akela. In the same way, I will say 2, I will say Sandeep, I will be saying T, and I will also be having one more employee information. I will say this is Anil, and I can say this is K, something like that, so on. So if I look at it, I have 3 columns, and how many rows? How many rows I have? 3 rows. And how many, and first row represents the columns, and how many columns I have? 3 columns. So now let me highlight this in bold, and you could see now the first row of my tab sheet represents the column names, and the next 3 rows represents the rows of those columns. All right. So now what is so important to understand over here is every column per se you take will be holding the same type of data. When I say ID, the ID will always be represented with some number. Am I right or wrong? Do you guys agree with me? So it's always be a number, correct? The number could be starting from 1 till it could be anything per se, any whole number per se you could take as an ID for an employee, correct? And if you look at the names, if you look at the first name and the last name and the first name will always be a sequence of characters. Do you guys agree with me? It's a sequence of characters, correct? P is one character, R is one character, U is another character, H, D, V, I is another character. So sequence of putting characters together will form a word, and this first name or the last name could be a combination of different words, correct? So, but ultimately these are the sequence of characters. So now when we put this sequence of characters together, we call this as a string. We call this as a string. So any sequence of characters per se, you put them together will form something called as a string. And even the last name will also be the sequence of characters. This will also be represented with the string. So this can also be called as a string. So the ID are the numerical numbers. The first name and the last name are basically the strings. So what do we call them as? We call them as the data types. That means every column you take in an Excel will hold the same type of a data, and that will be having something called as a data type. So when we say a column in an Excel sheet, it is basically the data plus the data type. So where will I see the data type of this particular column? So if I click over here, I can basically select the data type for a particular column. Let's say for my ID, I know my ID will always be having only the numbers. I will say the data type of my ID is going to be the numbers. You can adjust the precision by formatting this. I'll be clicking on the format cells and I will say decimal values to 0. So now everything I could see over here is being represented as an whole number. Okay, sorry. So one important takeaway from here is, if you take a column, the column should have same type of the data. So now can I say the column to be a KKK? Sorry, if I wanted to add a new row to my tab sheet, I will be, I will be basically adding a row something like this, where the ID is KKK and XJY and JJJ, whatever it could be. So is this a valid row? Why is it not a valid row? Why is this not a valid row?
ID should be number.
ID should be number, correct? So our conscious is telling the ID should be the number, correct? But when I put I just entered KKK, correct? Did Excel restricted me doing this? Did Excel restricted me doing this?
No, sir.
Did Excel restricted me doing this?
No, sir.
No, correct. That means it didn't throw any error. Am I right or wrong? I could still able to enter whatever I wanted to enter over here. Per se, in this case, it is a string. Am I right or wrong? So it is something that application doesn't take care of this, that a human has to be so conscious while entering the values into an Excel tab sheet to a particular column. Am I right or wrong? So that means every column you take should be linked with a particular data type, and you should be entering the same sort of data under that particular column. But when I entered something which is irrelevant, the Excel did not stop me in entering this. It didn't throw any error. Am I right or wrong? It did not throw me any error, correct? So one of the important takeaways from this particular from this Excel thing is, any column you take, it is basically, it will be having a data plus the data type. That means I had taken a column which is an ID, and I said this ID to be numbers at any point in time. And this combination is called as a schema. So the column name plus the data type together called as a schema, as simple as it is. That means any column you take for say will be having and data type attached to it. That means every column you say will be having a data type. When you say the column name plus the data type together, we call that as a schema. What does a schema will actually tell us? What is an important of a schema? Sorry?
It gives the entire information about what the column consists of.
Exactly. So that means the schema actually tells what data that column can contain. Correct? That means when I say IDs, it has been we are clearly saying that the ID should always contain numbers. The ID should always contain numbers. When I take a first name, which is a column 2 per se, which is the first name, it is basically a string, and this is also a schema. And I say column 3, the last name. What is the data type of this? String again. We call this as a schema. So that means the schema actually tells what data a column can contain. That means if I say an ID as a numbers, at any point in time, the ID can only have the numbers. When I say the first name as a string, at any point in time, that particular column can contain the sequence of characters or the sequence of numbers per se. It could be anything. It could be a number, it could be at the rate, it could be any sort of a special symbol, it could be anything per se. We'll talk about it. Okay. So that means when you look at a particular column, a column will be having a column name along with the data type mapped to it, which we both together call to be a schema, as simple as it is. So now the equivalent representation for a string in the Excel is the text. So when I put over here, it is basically general. I can say clearly this is going to be a text. Okay. So now ID is, what is the data type of an ID? The number. What is the data type of the first name? String. What is the data type of the last name? String. So the key important takeaway from this chapter is you will be having a columns and rows in a tab sheet, and every column will be mapped within data type. It should have a data type. And what is an importance and what is the significance of a data type?
Restricting the data that we are giving it to it.
Exactly. That means you are telling that, okay, I want this particular column to contain only numbers. I want this column to contain only strings. I want this column to contain only doubles or the precision values. In that way, this data types will be very helpful. So now when you look at the Excel application, even though I say the ID is basically a number, but I could still able to enter a string into this column where my Excel is not restricting me to do it. Are you guys getting the point? So now ultimately, why do we need this data? That's the question, correct? We are putting all this data fine, no problem, happy. Now what do you do with this data? That's the question, correct? What do you do with this data? We will use this data in several ways, correct? One, per se, you will store the data in the Excel sheets to basically use that information to represent that in the different forms, correct? One of it is doing some analysis where you will represent the data in the form of some sort of an visual diagrams where they will help you to tell what does the data actually contains. Am I right or wrong? Let's say if I wanted to basically perform some analysis on top of this, what type of an analysis what I will do is, I'll be doing some pivoting actions. I will also take one more thing called salary. Say 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, something like that. 4,000, 1,000. Now what will I do is, I will basically say oh shit, wait a minute. So now I will say name as the first name as Rose, and I say the salary as the value. Okay, and you could see clearly that this is a sum of a salary. So for each person, how much salary a company is basically paying is what you could able to see it over here. Am I right or wrong? So why do we need to store the data? To perform some sort of an analysis on top of it. That's one of the use of storing the data. Am I right or wrong? So now we could able to do lots of several things with this Excel sheet, but there are certain limitations that you could come across with this Excel sheet. What are those limitations? That's what we will be seeing. Any questions still here, per se, by anyone? Do you guys have any questions? Any questions from online audiences? Okay. All right. So now if you go back to this So one of the limitations with the Excel sheet is the limited size. So Excel sheets can go down or crash with large amount of data. That means if you have huge amount of the data, if you keep in a particular Excel sheet and if you try to do some analysis on top of it, which is a pivot operation in our case, which we already seen. If you wanted to do such type of operations or some sort of an aggregations to get certain metrics from your Excel sheet, that will slow down or it will crash. That means if you go beyond million rows in an Excel sheet, that cannot perform computation on top of that data because it has certain limitations. We'll talk about those limitations. And basic queries. Excel can perform basic data lookups and calculations. That means you could able to perform some sort of an data lookups and the calculations we just seen, correct? With the pivot operation. So those were very limited. That means you cannot perform advanced operations with your Excel sheet. And limited automation. That means if you wanted to automate your metrics and share those results with your stakeholders, like your sales team in your organization or the CEOs, CFOs, CIOs, if you want to share those information in periodical basis, it's going to be very challenging. That means you need to put lots of effort to automate the metrics that you wanted to show to this stakeholders, to the stakeholders. And advanced analysis. While Excel is good for basic analysis, but not for the advanced analysis because it has a limited size where you could not able to perform bigger operations or analytical operations on top of the Excel data. So what is the key takeaway from this chapter is Excel sheet consists of tab sheets where each tab sheet will consist of rows and columns, and column will always be attached with the data type, and column name plus the data type together has been called as an schema. And what is the importance of a schema? It will restrict it is not restricting at this moment in time, but it is up to the human conscious that he need to be very careful while inserting the data to there. Correct? That means if I say an ID as a number, he should need to, or he or she should need to ensure that at any point in time, that particular column should always contains the numbers. But the application is not throwing an error, correct? It's not restricting you to do that. Am I right or wrong? But it is up to the human conscious that the human has to be very careful while entering the data into the Excel sheet. Is it clear to everyone? Is it clear? Any questions? Guys, online audiences, could someone please confirm? Any questions?